All right, now we're moving on to evolution. Okay, in regards to evolution, the guy that figured this all out and is arguably one of the most important people in biology was Charles Darwin. When he was younger, his dad wanted him to study medicine, but he hated blood, so obviously that was not going to work out very well. So he was offered a position on the ship called the HMS Beagle, and what this ship was doing is it was kind of traveling around the Pacific and reaching different islands and such. And so he was collecting samples, and everywhere he went, he was writing down what he was observing. All right, so he developed his theory that species evolve over time. However, because this was back in the 1800s and there was a very big divide between religion and science, and the scientists of the day were not really religious people, because everybody that was heavily religious was butting heads and saying none of this could happen, this only happened the way the Bible said, etc., and that people were basically not being treated very well for coming up with any ideas in science, that he did not write anything about this for 25 years because he's afraid. All right, so this discovery went silent for 25 years because of the lack of support between the church and science. All right, so Charles Darwin, when he finally decided to write down and report his theory of evolution, and the book that he wrote is titled On the Origin of the Species, he said that evolution is a process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of the Earth. Basically, this just means that living organisms have changed over time because of the changing conditions of Earth, because of the different places they are living, and that we went from certain types of species and that eventually they changed over time, made more, and some disappeared. So, and the one thing that we need to point out is a theory in science is a well-tested explanation of events that have occurred in the natural world. All right, this is not the definition that you usually hear of theory that we've talked about, where it's just kind of like a guess. We think it might be happening. In science, a theory is an explanation that we know is true and is backed by a ton of evidence. Okay, so theory of natural selection, theory of evolution, these are all very proven and very backed facts by scientific research. All right, so natural selection. So this is how he proposed the populations changed over time. Okay, so he's explaining how evolution happened with his theory of natural selection. So he said that certain traits, like long beaks or thick fur, were better suited to help an individual survive in its environment. So if we have an individual that can survive in the environment, they're going to be able to reproduce. So if you have a bird that has a thick beak that can break open really hard shell seeds, and those are the only seeds available, they're going to be able to get the food to keep living, to then get to the age to reproduce and then pass on their traits. And so this idea basically just means that nature kind of selects which organisms survive in that type of environment. And it's obviously going to depend what the environment is. Okay, so we have 4 pillars of evolution. Our first one is genetic variation. Okay, since we know that no two individuals have the same exact DNA, because we have mutations. We've talked about the variation. We've also talked about independent assortment and segregation, on how that led to different genetic variation in families. This also happens throughout all different types of species. Okay, so we pass genes on to our children. So you can't pass things that aren't in your DNA to your kids. Okay, so if you have a long beak DNA type, you can't all of a sudden pass a short beak one if you don't have it. All right? Okay, so our second pillar is competition. So what happens is there's always more offspring that can actually survive that have been produced. So competition is going to arise because there's not unlimited resources. So if there's only so much food, you're going to have certain types of individuals that can get to that food easier or quicker that are going to survive better than the ones that can't. Okay, so unlimited resources would allow everybody to live. That doesn't happen. So we have part of a selection because of competition for food. All right, advantage. So survival of the fittest, I'm sure you've heard, which is natural selection. So because of this competition, some of those differences in the DNA are proven to be an advantage. So if they're more fit for that environment, so the ones with the thicker beaks that can break open those thicker shelled seeds, they're going to be more fit, and then the environment is naturally going to select them, and they're going to survive more, pass on their genes. Right? Okay, reproduction. So if we have individuals that have babies, can pass on their traits. If something can't reproduce, it can't pass on its traits, so obviously it's going to die off eventually. We also have individuals that if they die before they reach reproductive age or die without reproducing at a reproductive age, they will not pass on their traits. So those traits are eventually going to kind of disappear a little bit, and the population is going to shift to the organisms that are passing on their most advantageous traits. Okay, so kind of like the evolution of cell phones. We had certain things in cell phones that worked really well. So buttons kept getting passed on, as you see, but they got smaller and smaller and smaller. And then eventually we hit the iPhone, buttons went away. It was more easier for people to use, and they liked the ones better that had a touch screen. And that's why almost every cell phone now is a touch screen instead of the ones with buttons that there were quite a few, not even that many years ago. So that's just kind of an example of traits being passed on. All right, so the last ideas. Individuals do not evolve. Okay, this is important. Only the species itself as a whole evolves. So you can't be a bird, have a short beak, and then all of a sudden grow longer beaks. You have to be born with it. Okay, this is going to happen gradually, and it's going to happen over a very long period of time to add up to all these big changes. We can talk about some examples that happen a little bit quicker, but we're still talking like 20 years or so for some organisms that don't reproduce very quickly. All right, and then advantages in one environment might not be an advantage in the other environment. So if you're on an island that has certain type of seeds and then another species is on another island with a different type of seeds, you're going to have different adaptations, and those birds are going to be different for each environment. All right, and that's evolution in a nutshell.